Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. If you're a fan of pro sumo, you know these guys lead physically taxing lives. Pain, aches, and injuries are all part of the deal. But, as much as possible, wrestlers get in the ring despite all that and compete to the best of their ability. They don't miss matches or drop out of tournaments unless they absolutely have to. With that in mind, there have been so many injury absences in sumo this year that I wanted to try and puzzle out the factors that lead to all these injuries. Then I wanted to take a look at how wrestlers live and train and figure out if there might be better ways to protect their health. Now, if you've been around this channel for a minute, you know I like to get my research on, and I went down a deep rabbit hole for this one. It wasn't just massive data collection either. There's plenty of data on exercise-related topics, for example, but trying to find good information on the sumo lifestyle is trickier than you might think. Plenty of people have written articles or reports on the topic, and some stables are open to visitors recording how they go about their day, but in the end, sumo is insular enough that you have to accept some of the information available may be inaccurate. I leaned on what looked like the safest information available, and the ensuing script got so long that I was planning to make it into 3 videos, not just one. And then I found out some of the most critical info was wrong. But that's okay. The necessary adjustments made this script both more accurate and more condensed, and that's good. And yeah, I promise, this is very much the condensed version. I'll link everything I leaned on for knowledge in the description, whether or not it makes an appearance in this version. Alright, let's start at the beginning with the injuries themselves. Injuries have always been something of an issue in sumo. The Kosho system that allowed wrestlers a free absence without losing rank was started all the way back in 1972. What's interesting about it is that, in retrospect, it seems rather forward-thinking. In the top division, the first Kosho wasn't taken until 1974, there weren't multiple Koshos in a year until 1980, and they didn't see 6 or more Koshos, so an average of 1 per tournament, until 1993. Juryo had them a little more often, but after 2 Koshos in 1972, Juryo didn't have another one until 1975. So currently, there are calls to bring these free absences back because there are so many injuries, but the system wasn't introduced when there was an epidemic of wrestlers needing time to heal. It was a system that looked like it would be rarely needed, so it seemed fair to give a rikishi here and there a chance to rest and maintain rank. The use of Kosho spiked in 1993 and, on average, stayed far higher than where it had been from the system's inception until it was removed after 2003 due to suspected abuse. But a couple of things stand out. Number 1, if you look at Koshos versus overall absences in the top division, there's quite a strong correlation between Koshos used and total non-Yokozuna absences. Nothing indicates Makuuchi wrestlers were abusing the system. More Koshos were being claimed, but more guys overall were hurt and either dropping out of bashos or unable to enter at all. You would expect more Koshos under those circumstances. Unfortunately, the situation looked worse in Juryo. The number of Koshos were a much higher percentage of total absences than in Makuuchi from 1996 on, and there was more incentive to claim a relatively minor injury as a reason to go Kosho. If you dropped out of Makuuchi, you still landed in Juryo and earned a salary. Dropping out of Juryo was far worse. So, between unfriendly statistics and a clear incentive for some wrestlers to BS their injuries, it wasn't unreasonable to think the system was being used improperly. Still, the complete removal of the Kosho system may have been short-sighted. For one thing, the simple percentages don't account for wrestlers who may have dropped out of a Makuuchi tournament, fallen to Juryo, and then needed a Kosho. Taking a Kosho absence required being injured in competition. If that happened to someone and they ended up with very few wins, or none at all, they could be demoted from a division from even a relatively high rank. That could have contributed to the Juryo numbers looking sketchy. However, and in my view more importantly, there's the second and simpler thing that stands out. The wrestlers themselves were changing. To show how significant these changes were, we need stats. To collect these stats, I randomized a year and a basho from each decade, then took the age, height, and weight for everyone in the top division during that basho. After that, I calculated their weight to height ratios, kilograms divided by centimeters. On screen, you can see a spreadsheet layout of the stats. In addition to the randomized bashos, I also took data from March 2021, since it was the latest information available on SumoDB, and May 2024, since it was still on the Sumo Association page. I was going to get deep into the numbers, but I don't think it's necessary. All we need to know is this: top division wrestlers have, on average, gotten older, taller, and heavier. An interesting quirk is that 2007 is the only time average weight went down from the decade before, and from 2006 through 2012, non-Yokozuna injury absences were down a bit from the late 90s and well below the early 2000s peak. Across that decade, average age went up about 6 months. So if age went up, weight went down, and injuries went down, that suggests there's more of a correlation between size and injury than age and injury. But both age and size correlate with higher rates of injury in general. May 2024 had the largest measurements for Rikishi on record, and 2024 has already had 18 non-Yokozuna Kyujos. At that pace, we'll finish the year with 36, which would be far and away the most ever. Are we likely to get there? Probably not. It's hard to explain why the period from 2001 to 2005 had so many more absences than the years on either side, despite most of the same wrestlers competing. Even eliminating Koshos, the numbers are still quite high, and 2005 had 29 absences with no Kosho system in place. It was a statistical outlier, and 2024 will probably end up being a statistical outlier as well. The absence spikes aren't the issue though. It's that the baseline of how many absences happen each year keeps rising. And it's not simply an issue of guys sitting out. More injuries that require absence point to more injuries that Rikishi fight through. All respect in the world to Tomokaze and Tsurugisho for getting out there every day in May, but even though they're not part of these numbers, their situations are just as much a part of the problem. But although I mentioned Koshos, this isn't about dealing with injured Rikishi in a more equitable way. We already made a video about that. We're making this video because there's also the longer-term question of how to reduce the frequency and magnitude of these injuries in the future. Excess injury risk both undercuts promising careers and shrinks the number of athletes willing to take that risk, which means fewer and fewer wrestlers coming through the ranks to provide good examples of what healthy sumo looks like at the top levels. And that type of sumo is what helps fund the lifestyle all these guys lead. So if injury levels are most closely correlated with Rikishi getting bigger, and secondary to that, getting older, what can be done? Let's tackle the age thing first. If the Sumo Association wants more young Rikishi at the top of the sport, then they need more Rikishi in the sport, period. That's an issue they've been grappling with for years, and if there was an easy answer, they'd have fixed the problem already. It's also probably going to be harder and harder to recruit particularly young Rikishi when they can get experience in high school and university and an education to fall back on before deciding whether to subject themselves to the pro sumo grind. And the less likely they are to get hurt in school compared to the pro ranks, the smarter the amateur route becomes. A salaried wrestler, even in Juryo, makes well more than the median salary in Japan. But until you get there, you make pocket change. Sumo has to figure out how to convince more young people that either the sumo lifestyle is right for them or that it's worth the time and effort and, frankly, trauma that it takes to reach the second division, even though only a small fraction of wrestlers ever get there. Their best odds are probably with good university wrestlers who might be able to see a path to the salaried ranks and come into the sport fully grown but with less wear and tear on their bodies, but there are only so many of those guys to recruit. I don't have any good suggestions. I simply wish the association luck. Now we can talk about size. This is complex because there isn't a good argument for wrestlers to get smaller. Size can be a strategy unto itself. Furthermore, being smaller doesn't necessarily create less risk of injury, it just changes where those injuries are likely to come from. Being on the smaller side might result in less stress on the body, but it also means you have less armor to protect you when you get hit, and you're easier to launch off the dohyo if the big boys catch you. And the higher you go in the sport as an Enho or Midori Fuji type, the more likely you are to run into opponents who are much bigger but can still keep up with you athletically. So if being big can lead to injury from having to carry that weight, but being small can lead to injury from getting hit by the guys with the weight, what's the answer? How do these Rikishi minimize the odds of getting hurt? First, let's briefly explain how they're able to get so big. It starts with skipping breakfast. The extremely long workouts they put themselves through every day happen before they eat. For the presumably near 100% of us who aren't pro sumo wrestlers, the idea of working out 4 to 5 hours every morning without eating breakfast sounds insane. And that's fair because for us it would be insane. General advice says to eat before a workout so you have energy because that's the best idea for just about everyone. But gaining size is an imperative in sumo, and skipping breakfast helps accomplish this because of how it plays with the body's metabolism. Your metabolism is what burns calories to create energy for the body to use. When you sleep, your body's metabolism slows down. You might have heard at some point in your life that eating breakfast tells your body to wake up to get started on the day. This is true. Eating is the signal for your metabolism to speed back up. The flip side is that if you skip breakfast, your body maintains more of a sleepy time metabolism until you eat. The longer your metabolism is low, the fewer calories you burn, and thus the more calories that stick. On top of that, while you go through the morning burning fewer calories, you get hungrier and hungrier, so once you get to eat, you want to absolutely pound the food down. And that goes for anyone. Busting your ass for 4 hours only amplifies this effect. So wrestlers aren't able to eat 4 or 5 or 6,000 calorie lunches just because they're big and force the food in. The whole regimen is built towards making them able to eat that much. After lunch, they take a nap. This plays into what the body generally wants to do after packing away a huge amount of food, so it's not like they have to be forced to sleep, but this rest also serves the purpose of slowing their metabolisms again. Then they get up, do whatever else they need to do with their day, and dinner takes place relatively close to when they go to sleep to again minimize how many of those calories get burned off. The whole system is designed for maximum caloric intake with minimum time where their metabolisms are going full force. It's pretty ingenious. The flip side is that any noticeable change to this structure could dramatically impact a Rikishi's ability to put on or keep on weight. If you watch Chris Sumo's videos or otherwise pay attention to Sumo news, you might have heard about Coach Nakamura's intention to do things differently. He's giving his wrestlers breakfast and setting up a different training schedule. We'll talk about training later, but can we determine what effect that third meal is likely to have? Sort of. The main dilemma is that the change in structure with when they eat and how they train go hand in hand. John Gunning was kind enough to answer some questions I had, and one thing he said was that Rikishi don't eat before Keiko, their regular morning workouts, because they'll likely yak it up. As he said, newcomers who thought they could eat a protein bar and be okay were often disabused of that notion. So, letting wrestlers eat a good breakfast not only creates a structure somewhat closer to what us international fans might expect from pro athletes, it largely demands they get away from the 4 or 5 hour grind fests that make up traditional sumo training so the wrestlers can keep the food down. Still, we can make some rough calculations. As this paper explains, the body's metabolism drops by 15% during sleep. This isn't an instant drop-off, of course, and there are complicating factors like the fact this changes depending on what state of sleep a person is in. But for simplicity's sake, let's treat it as an average. The body burns 15% fewer calories during sleep than when awake. Now, let's take a Rikishi who's young and trying to get bigger. 20 years old, 6 foot or 183 centimeters, and 220 pounds or 100 kilos. Given the extremity of sumo training, it's fair to say he fits in the last category here, very intense exercise daily, even with a day off during the week. Pro sumo wrestlers have an average body fat percentage of 26.2% according to this study. If we use the Catch-McArdle calculator, which takes body fat percentage into account, he needs 3,732 calories per day to maintain his weight. If he has somewhat lower body fat, which is probable if he's still trying to get bigger, that number gets closer to 4,000. If he wants to gain weight, he needs even more, 500 calories per day over the maintenance level to gain 1 pound per week. If someone's going to burn 4,000 calories per day and they have a relatively standard 16 hours awake and 8 asleep, then they're burning around 175 calories per hour awake and just under 150 per hour asleep, a 25 calorie per hour difference. If a sumo wrestler wakes up and doesn't eat for 6 hours and his metabolism stays around that sleep level instead of an awake level, he's burning 150 fewer calories for that whole morning. If we assume the post-lunch nap results in 2 more hours of that reduced metabolism, then he's burning 200 fewer calories than if he was awake in a quote-unquote normal way the whole day. When you consider these guys scarf double or triple the calories most of us consume in a day, 200 calories may not sound like much. But if a Rikishi's diet gives him that 500 calorie surplus per day, burning an extra 200 calories cuts that surplus almost in half, which means he's gaining weight at about half the speed he otherwise would. There are other factors in play as well. One of the major ones for Rikishi is that it takes calories to digest food. For the average person, this is about 10% of their calories burned for the day. For sumo wrestlers, that's inevitably going to be higher because of their intake. They have to eat even more, specifically because of how much they're eating. And as they grow, the calories needed to maintain their current weight keep increasing. At 6 feet tall, for every 10 kilos of weight they gain, they need 304 more calories per day to maintain it. The 4,000 calories needed to maintain 100 kilos becomes over 5,600 at 150 kilos. Even if we assume body fat percentage increases as they grow, from in this case 20% to the 26.2% average, maintenance calories still rise from 4,000 to 5,246. So if they view size as a primary goal, you can understand how every calorie matters. Nonetheless, this discussion isn't happening in a vacuum. The discussion at hand involves a different structure of when they eat, when they work out, and what their workouts consist of. With respect purely to their calorie intake, even if we assume Nakamura's training regimen will result in more calories burned during the day, there's still the question of whether eating breakfast and lunch will allow them to take in enough extra calories to make up the deficit. And that, unfortunately, is not a question I can answer. More to the point, this is such a specific situation that even though I'm happy to speculate when it gets us oriented in the general direction of the truth, figuring this out would require so much speculation that I'm not sure where to begin. I'm not a nutritionist, and I'm reaching the edges of my knowledge in this regard. What's more important, though, is Nakamura's statement that he wants his guys to be more athletic. I take that to mean he wants wrestlers who are quicker and more mobile rather than lumbering and relying on size as a primary strategy. That doesn't mean he's against size or would try to limit how big his wrestlers get. It's more likely he's simply not putting maximum priority on size and quite possibly is looking to hit that point where his guys are as big as they can be without losing athleticism. We think of smaller wrestlers as the athletic ones, but that's because they don't have a choice. Guys can become athletic as they get bigger and pack on muscle, but there's always a point where if they're able to keep growing, they will start to lose some of their athleticism. Just look at Mitoryu. There's one other aspect of the sumo diet that I thought needed to be discussed: beer. If you look up what a sumo wrestler's diet looks like, there are a lot of articles out there that talk about it. Sometimes it seems like they're getting their information from very similar places, which means if one source is wrong, a lot of the others will be as well. Still, some things remain consistent. Sumo wrestlers don't eat breakfast, they have gargantuan lunches, although the calorie count listed can vary wildly, and they chug-a-lug that beer. Except they don't. I mean, they do drink, and some of them reportedly drink a lot, but it's pretty common to see different websites say they drink at lunch, often quite a bit, up to 6 beers, 8 beers, something like that. I asked John Gunning about this as well because I figured those numbers seemed kinda high, but maybe 2 or 3? After all, they're supposed to nap right after lunch and the beer can't hurt in that regard. Nope, beer at lunch is not common, or with dinner. It's only a thing when socializing and thus happens more late in the evening. I appreciate all the information John was willing to share, but this even more than the rest. I ended up doing a lot of research about the effects of alcohol after working out, the effect on muscles when drinking to excess, and so on before reaching out to him, and if he hadn't been willing to help, I would have jammed one foot all the way in my mouth and the other halfway in behind it. I used the best information available, but it turns out that information was absolute dog shit. Rikishi do not shotgun Asahis with their Chenko, so don't believe any website that says they do. Alright, so they don't usually drink with meals, but what about if they get drunk off their asses at other times? The main thing here is how often it happens. As Dan Savage has said, it's fine to do things in moderation, but it's also okay to do things to excess in moderation. In this case, if a wrestler goes out and gets bombed off his ass, but it's only once in a great while, that's not really going to impact his career. If a wrestler starts regularly misusing alcohol, though, that's when the longer-term negative effects can creep in. That brings us to this paper, which is a review of studies done on and around the topic of alcohol's impact on skeletal muscle. In the introduction, they reference one study that shows 40 to 60% of people with alcohol misuse have alcohol-related myopathy, which is a catch-all name for disorders in the muscles. That alone sounds pretty bad for pro sumo wrestlers. And acute alcohol-related myopathy presents as rhabdomyolysis. Rhabdomyolysis, or simply rhabdo to some people, is literally the breakdown of muscle tissue. As they point out, this can happen after any given binge drinking session. They define this as a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 grams per deciliter, which sounds complicated, but grams per deciliter is what a breathalyzer tests. Getting too drunk to legally drive, which is usually what we associate with a 0.08 blood alcohol level, isn't that hard. Now, it does take more drinks for a big-ass sumo wrestler to hit that point. Larger people have more blood in their bodies, so the alcohol is more diluted. Furthermore, the more muscle you have, the less you're affected by alcohol, in part because the body needs more blood to support a large mass of muscle than a large mass of fat. The average man, at least in America, has about 5.5 liters of blood in his body. The average top division Rikishi at 160 kilos and 26% body fat has probably between 9 and 10 liters. That's a lot. Even so, it doesn't take that much extra drinking to hit the 0.08 mark. No matter how big you are, the liver can only process about 1 drink per hour, so you're not metabolizing the alcohol in your system any quicker than someone half your size. The average man needs about 4 drinks to get there. If you figure he consumes those drinks over an hour, so one of them is metabolized by his liver during that time, he needs 5. If he's drinking a little more slowly and takes 2 hours, he needs 6. A Rikishi who's twice his size and packed with muscle, drinking for 2 hours, needs 8 drinks, maybe 9. If he's drinking faster, like if he's doing shots or just chugging, he needs less. Granted, 8 or 9 drinks is a lot, and doing that regularly is probably secretary territory because they either need to buy all that alcohol or have supporters get it for them. Or maybe some lower division guys spend their allowances on whatever the Japanese equivalent of Mad Dog is. Regardless, it's unlikely a large percentage of Rikishi binge drink often enough to break down a problematic amount of muscle. The reason I still bring it up is that, for those who do, they're almost certainly not going to realize what exactly they're doing to themselves. According to the Cleveland Clinic, the 4 main symptoms of rhabdo are muscle swelling, weak muscles, tender and sore muscles, and dark pee. A wrestler could easily connect the first 3 with training and the last with dehydration. In fact, one of the other potential symptoms listed is dehydration. There's also decreased urination, nausea, and loss of consciousness, all of which can be attributed to more basic issues like drinking a little too much or not having enough water. Nothing in here is going to click with a Rikishi, or probably most people, as being damaging to their muscles. As for consequences, the researchers point out that alcohol-related rhabdo predominantly affects muscles of the pelvic and shoulder girdles. For a sumo wrestler then, this affects them around the hips where all that weight is sitting, and the shoulders where they often take the biggest impacts. Not great! Symptoms resolve after 1 to 2 weeks of abstinence, but the muscle has already been broken down, the damage is done. And when you're part of a sport that's so taxing on the body, even if you're in this state 2 or 3 times a week rather than every day, it's hard for the body to recover from these little chips you're making in its ability to recover and stay strong. Like I said, I doubt this affects many wrestlers. Even someone who's famous and enjoys being feted by supporters relatively often can go out several times a week, have 3 or 4 drinks over a couple hours every time, and not particularly suffer from this issue. But we're talking about a country where drinking is a cultural norm, and on top of that, I have no idea what their pain management options are like. I have no doubt some guys drink at least some of the time to dull whatever aches they have. They need all that muscle to keep their bodies together though, so if drinking because of pain gets excessive, they end up undercutting themselves rather than dealing with the problem. Alright, enough about food and beer. Food and beer. Training! Let's talk about training. This is more in my wheelhouse than nutrition, and this is where Coach Nakamura has created a more interesting conversation. Before I get to the guy who wants to do things differently though, it's important to point out that the activities in Keiko, sumo practice, pretty much all make sense. The majority of it is what we call sport-specific training. For example, hitting the teppo pole gives a wrestler reps on a basic sumo movement and also forces everything from the hands to the shoulders to get tougher so the wrestler can hit harder without hurting themselves. Butsukari, the chest-lending exercise where one wrestler pushes another across the ring, engages the movement a wrestler needs to push their opponent back. And Shikos, which have become recognized as a pretty good exercise for lots of people to do, strengthen the small muscles in and around the hips and back to create more stability and support for the work the large muscles do in matches. But there's one thing we really never hear about sumo wrestlers doing, and that's heavy lifting. This is also something I asked John Gunning about, and here was his response. These days, virtually all Rikishi, or at least those with serious ambitions of climbing the Banzuke, lift. It's been a part of sumo for decades in some form or another, but more structured now with many guys going to gyms in the evenings. There are normally a few weights in Keikoba, but just things like light dumbbells. The Keikoba is the practice room, by the way. Lifting isn't part of regular morning practice to any great extent, it's more something that's done outside or in stable weight rooms in the evening. Yes Theory put out a video a year ago where they trained at Onomatsu stable, and one guy stayed the night so they saw most of the training day. The only sekitori there at the time was Onosho, but as we can see, the whole team lifted together. This goes along with what John said, and it makes sense. Improved sumo performance through lifting goes back to at least Chiono Fuji, and as Chris Sumo relayed in comments from Sankei Sports, the old Musashigawa stable was the first to make weight training part of their normal approach back in the 90s, so it looks like this is pretty normalized. But all of that makes another part of the same video from Chris stand out as more than a little weird. This is another translation from Coach Hidenoyama, the ex-Koto Shogiku. His career ran from 2002 to 2020 after Musashigawa instituted its lifting program and as lifting became more normalized in the sport. For a guy active in sumo during that time frame, some of what he's saying is a little bit, huh? Let's take this piece by piece. Sumo wrestlers build their bodies upon foot stamps, leg slides, and pole slaps. Yeah, of course. They're some of the first exercises young wrestlers learn before most of them should even think about weightlifting, and nobody's saying these things should go away. So, as a general statement, yeah, this is true. That's what the ex-Hakuho did over and over again till he was drenched all over in sweat to build up the flexibility needed to lower the risk of injury. Couple of things here. One, this fundamentally misunderstands an important part of injury prevention. Yes, flexibility is crucial, and lacking it can lead to a noticeably higher risk of certain injuries depending on the activity one is involved with. But growing and strengthening the muscles, tendons, and ligaments is also incredibly important. Equating flexibility alone with injury prevention is pretty common though, so I'm not going to bag on him too much about this. 2. Of course Hakuho did all this core sumo work. And while I can't imagine that Hakuho, as competitive as he was, never tried lifting, maybe the implication that it was never a crucial component of his training is true. But making this part of his defense of traditional sumo training is like saying Michael Jordan never had to do calf raises to jump so high. Even if it's true, you're saying it about the GOAT. That's not an example you can apply to everyone. And in Hakuho's case, it's very possible a lot of guys lifted, but not many knew how to maximize its effectiveness, or that it couldn't be maximally effective because regular sumo training impeded what they could get out of it. Thus, they didn't catch up nearly as much as they could have to someone focused more on traditional training. Abandon that in favor of a focus on weight training and your muscles will overly tighten, increasing the injury risk. This is another myth and it's absolute nonsense. It's only true if you don't stretch, but these guys put plenty of time into staying flexible. More than that, when muscles repair themselves from workout damage and get stronger, they do that by becoming thicker. If lifting leads to reduced flexibility, it's because of that thickening in the muscle fibers. But sumo wrestlers have huge muscles. Even if they get those muscles without lifting, their muscle fibers still have to increase significantly in thickness for them to get that big. There's very little reason to think lifting will have a negative impact on flexibility when regular sumo training doesn't. With respect to sumo, I imagine that apart from the general myth, this belief stems from the fact that their bodies probably feel a lot tighter after a lifting session than regular keiko. But in morning training, their bodies are extremely warmed up and they sweat a ton. The muscles are as loose as they can be during that time. On the flip side, even though warming up well before lifting is a good idea, you don't want to go too far with it or else you won't have the energy to lift as effectively as possible. That doesn't mean long term that lifting will reduce flexibility. They need to stretch sufficiently after each lifting session, but as long as they do that, this is a non-issue. Core sumo movements are best for helping you grasp your true condition. That's why, in my active days, no matter how hurt I was, I'd try to do a few foot stamps on the practice dohyo to ascertain how much I needed to loosen my muscles. This sounds very reasonable because it is, but it has exactly zero to do with optimal training. If you're hurt, you can't train properly. But, especially as a pro athlete, when injured, you want to minimize your loss of condition. If doing foot stamps helped him realize he needed to move around to warm up or stretch or whatever, that's great. I'm glad he had something that worked for him. But a lifter can do the exact same thing. I'm finding now as a coach that younger wrestlers tend to have balance problems. They can lift something heavy on two legs, but get them to balance on just the one and they soon start to totter. There's something not right with their core axis, which I feel can be corrected by extra foot stamping. Okay. Really, this makes sense. Foot stamping involves coming up on one leg in a slow controlled movement, which requires a lot of fine muscle control, especially in the hips and legs. If you're on one foot and it's flat on the ground, the hips and legs are where you need sufficient strength to hold whatever position you're trying to be in. There are weightlifting exercises that can target these areas, but to improve balance specifically, foot stamping is as good an option as any. This is very reasonable, but in no way does that preclude lifting from being a key part of training. If his wrestlers' major muscle groups are getting stronger and they need more shikos and foot stamps to help the supporting muscles keep up, that's not a problem. That's the whole point. The myths and misunderstandings evident here hurt current wrestlers in a couple of ways. One, it means that while their coaches, their stable masters, are charged with making them the best they can be, clearly some coaches aren't willing to look at all the ways their wrestlers can reach their potential. That's not explicitly knocking an attachment to traditional training either. Everyone's different, and the correct balance between traditional movements and more modern lifting practices will be different for each wrestler and each body. But traditional training methods aren't going away and shouldn't, so it's a lot easier to envision coaches who endorse lifting programs finding that balance rather than tradition-minded coaches who think lifting causes problems in and of itself. Second, at this point, I doubt even coaches who feel like Hide no Yama will actually prevent their wrestlers from lifting on their own time. But those wrestlers will be a lot more likely to do things incorrectly, and whether that leads to less of a performance boost than they might like, or outright injury due to poor technique or a bad program, any negative outcome will be pounced on by anti-lifting coaches as more reason to minimize working with weights. That's going to make this whole mindset that much harder to break. And I do think it's important to break that mindset for the general health of the athletes. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with current sumo exercises, and there's no clear reason to stop or dramatically reduce how much they're done. but there's a lot to be gained from proper lifting, not just in terms of power, but also maintaining joint health, reducing injury risk, and slowing how quickly the body breaks down under the strain of the sumo lifestyle. It doesn't take a hyper-specific plan of action to gain those benefits either. In one study, the knee cartilage of elite weightlifters was tested against that of inactive men of about the same size. The cartilage was found to be significantly thicker in the weightlifter group in most of the analyzed regions. More importantly for our purposes, this increased thickness was not related to how long their training sessions were, but it was correlated with time of training onset. In other words, when the weightlifter started lifting. It's only one study, so they're not going to make any declarative statements, but they point out that mechanical loading history could exert an influence on cartilage morphology, how the cartilage is built. History is doing a lot of work there too. You're not going to build up thick knee cartilage by hitting the weight super hard all of a sudden. You need a history of lifting for this to happen. I assume wrestlers in high school and college are lifting plenty, and anyone who joins sumo as a teenager should do the same thing. By the way, it is true that teenagers should be careful about lifting heavy, but they can still lift. Alright, so hitting the weights in general should provide benefits to joint health over time. If most rikishi are lifting though, does that mean they're already getting those benefits, or is there something more specific they could be doing? I mean, do you think I'd be getting into all this if I didn't think there was a better way? Please bear in mind that I'm working with limited information, or at least less information than I'd like. I understand how regular sumo training broadly works, and I've seen what lifting sessions have been posted online. I'm basing all of this on inferences stemming from that knowledge, but it's not impossible that some things are done very differently and just nobody has ever recorded and posted it. I said we rarely hear about sumo wrestlers doing heavy lifting, and the heavy part is doing more work in that sentence than it might seem. Part of that is because there's the idea in some corners that sumo training is still just foot stamps, shikos, chest lending, and practice bouts. It's also because, as we can see from this Tatsunami stable practice recorded by the legend Sarah Likes Sumo, sometimes we do see them with weights, but it's frequently stuff like this, doing warm-ups with weights that, for them, may be taxing after numerous reps, but don't really qualify as heavy. The only example I found of a sumo wrestler doing genuinely heavy work in the weight room is this video of Teruno Fuji. Like everything else, it's among the links in the description if you want to watch it all, but the numbers he's moving are nuts. And he's doing it for one rep or very few reps, which is the idea behind heavy lifting. But hey, I hear some sharp-eyed viewers saying, that one shot from Onomatsu stable said the guy was squatting 140 kilos. Google's calculator says that's over 300 pounds. That's heavy. My response to that is, are you sure? He's obviously working hard. I'm not claiming this is easy or that a sumo wrestler who can't bang out sets of 10 at this weight is a scrub. We also don't get to see what happens after he stands, so we have no idea if this is a single rep or if he's doing more. What I do want to point out is the limited depth of the squat. It's not wrong in and of itself. I'm sure a lot of us who lift have been taught how important it is to work the full range of motion, but partial reps are a thing and they can be used to great effectiveness. The main reason you would use partial reps are for strength within a specific range of motion, hypertrophy, and training around injury. Since this wrestler doesn't have any knee wraps or anything, I'll assume he's not working around an injury. But the other two still make sense. Hypertrophy is muscle growth, and while you'll get that with most lifting programs, partial reps can do more to stimulate it because they make you spend longer in the range of motion where mechanical tension is highest. You don't hit that point at the end of the lift where the muscles get a brief respite before you put them to work again. And when sumo wrestlers engage in a match, they're generally working from a partial squat, so this seems to fit the sport-specific use as well. So what's the problem? The problem is that, as far as I can tell, partial reps are way too common. If you watch some videos of Jungyos, the public events they hold between bashos, I'm sure you'll see some wrestlers doing half push-ups against the dohyo. There's a video I can't find anymore of Kotoeko doing squats with an attendant piggybacked on it. These events aren't lifting sessions, so in that context they make sense, but there are other videos of wrestlers in training doing the same half push-ups. The Tatsunami warm-ups involve squats of about the same depth. There's another clip from Onomatsu where the guy is walking in a partial crouch with a 30-pound water bag on his shoulders. I can't find anything to indicate sumo workouts or lifting sessions routinely involve a more well-rounded range of motion than that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, I have no way to know that, but it doesn't seem like it happens enough. What it looks like, for all the world, is that sumo wrestlers and their coaches realized somewhere along the way that resistance exercises with shorter movements would help grow the muscles and fit the movements necessary for sumo. So yes, they serve a purpose, but you know how Hideno Yama said it was a problem that guys could lift a lot but had poor balance? The same idea applies here. If too much work is done in this partial range of motion and not enough at the full range, then the wrestlers' bodies aren't as adapted to being in different positions. But this is a sport that's designed to put your opponent in positions they don't want to be in. Working the full range of motion with these exercises makes it more likely they can both hang in a fight even when forced into an undesired position and resist injury when pushed into those positions as well. Getting back to Coach Nakamura, he's indicated, apparently with the blessing of some sports news outlets, that he's going to do things differently. 3 meals a day, including a good breakfast. Cardio in the morning, which I take to mean regular sumo training, just in a shortened form. Then I've heard both practice bouts and lifting in the afternoon, so I'm not sure what the exact plan is. Maybe it's both, or one or the other depending on circumstances. But what can he do to maximize the chances his different way of doing things works out? First, I'm not going to suggest an exact lifting plan. I don't know what exactly he has them do the rest of the time, and I'd be getting well out of my lane to suggest specific programs. It would be easy to lay out a schedule that makes sense in a vacuum, but would either be too difficult given the other work they do, or would make the other necessary work less effective. These are broader suggestions. Maybe strong suggestions, but broad ones. Number 1, focus on compound lifts. That's bench, squat, and deadlift. For any athlete, having the body work in sync is important, and since compound lifts work the most muscles at once, it reduces the odds of imbalances forming. It also makes it easier to correct imbalances that do occur. Accessory exercises aren't a bad idea, but traditional sumo exercises like shikos will hit some of those notes already. If a wrestler has some physical limitations that require them to use a machine, like the leg press instead of regular squats, it's more likely they'll need accessory work to maintain muscle balance throughout the body. Number 2, remember that strength equals endurance, but endurance doesn't necessarily equal strength. What does that mean? With respect to resistance training, think of strength as being able to lift a heavy weight once or a small number of times, and endurance as being the ability to move a lesser weight many times. Sumo wrestlers obviously need both. For that reason, the nature of traditional sumo training makes some sense. Clearly, the training combined with huge amounts of food helps the wrestlers get bigger and stronger, so they're put through hours of intense work to increase endurance. However, when you're training with weights and doing variable numbers of reps, once you're able to move more weight one time, you'll also be able to move a lesser weight more times than you could before. For example, if you can bench press 135 pounds once and 100 pounds 6 times, then if you improve your 1 rep to 150, you should be able to bench 100 pounds 8 or 9 times. And it makes sense, right? It would be weird if you increased how much you could lift one time, but lifting lighter weights didn't get easier. On the flip side, let's say that instead of working with the higher weights and lower reps conducive to increasing a 1 rep max, you always do at least 6 reps per set and you don't go above 100 pounds until you can do it at least 8 times. Will you reach that goal? Sure. Are you stronger once you do? Yeah, in a very real way. But it's significantly less likely you'll also be able to bench press 150 pounds all of a sudden. The other adaptations the body needs to make to lift a heavier weight haven't happened because you haven't subjected your body to the necessary stress. The main shortcoming of traditional training is that everything is designed around building the physical and mental fortitude to do difficult things many times by doing them many times. The unique stresses placed on the body by trying to do a very difficult thing once aren't really present, which is kind of surprising in a sport with very short matches that are often decided by singular bursts of strength. By increasing the mechanical loads wrestlers have to deal with, their bodies will adapt and not only be able to do more in short bursts, but also over longer periods of time. And this doesn't just have to mean lifting weights. There's no reason why, for example, tachi practice or foot slides can't be done with a band around the waist and a teammate holding onto it to create extra resistance. Number 3, get younger wrestlers who are still building their bodies to do more lifts with the full range of motion. Why do I specify younger wrestlers? Well, the main reason is that they need it the most. They're still building size and strength all over, so getting their bodies acclimated to consistently carrying more size and doing more work in all positions will be very helpful to their general health without taking away from their ability to develop greater strength within those sport-specific ranges of motion down the road. The other reason is that veteran wrestlers, especially successful ones, may have a method that works for them. Bodies are unique, especially ones that have been adapted to perform a specific function, and even if a certain change would have been great for someone had he incorporated it early in his career, now it might throw him off and do more harm than good. In addition, veterans are often hurt in one way or another, and full range of motion may no longer be possible, or, more often, currently too difficult. In the latter case, it can be worth working with them to improve that range, but that can be a slow process and needs to be tailored to the individual. But getting stronger through the full range of motion means they have more ways to limit hitting a plateau, and they'll also get stronger within shorter ranges of motion as well. So anyone who can do the full range of motion of an exercise should at least try. Number 4. Understand what makes partial reps good and have your wrestlers do them in a way that maximizes their usefulness. For example, super heavy reps. This is the reason I questioned whether the Onomatsu's wrestler 140 kilo squat was really heavy. He was slow and controlled, but only went part way down. If he could do a full squat at 140 kilos though, then he could do that partial squat at 160, maybe 170. That's a lot more weight, but if you know what guys can do for a full squat, you know they should be able to do more for a partial, and thus you can challenge them more appropriately. In addition, the heavier partial reps help force adaptation through the rest of the body. To lift more weight, for example, the central nervous system has to adapt to the stress of moving larger weights. So, one effect of doing a heavy partial squat is to train the body to simply withstand being under the pressure of the greater weight. Likewise, the body sends more blood to tendons and ligaments under greater strain. Someone who has a bar on the rack in front of them, for example, lifts it maybe 3 inches and holds it, is putting a ton of stress on their elbows and shoulders. This helps thicken and stiffen the tendons and ligaments, and stiffer tendons and ligaments do a better job of protecting joints. This helps increase effective strength and is obviously pretty useful for injury prevention. Pause reps. This is mostly for squats, although it can apply to the bench as well. Pause reps are exactly what they sound like. The lifter pauses at the bottom of the movement with their body under load. This can be done with a relatively heavy weight, so the pause adds extra difficulty but otherwise it's a normal lift, or a lighter one, so the lift is fast and helps develop the appropriate fast twitch muscles. Speed or ballistic reps. These are done with a lighter weight at a high speed. These are somewhat harder to master than just lifting a heavy thing, but they're surprisingly difficult and good at developing fast twitch muscles. Bench and deadlift are generally done with full range of motion, but squats often are not. Only the concentric part, the lift itself, needs to be fast. The eccentric part, getting back into position, needs to be controlled, although some people have gotten good at doing that quickly as well. Alternately, a balance can be struck between hitting the weights and lifting heavy and doing fast partial reps with exercises outside the weight room. This is where exercises like partial push-ups or piggyback squats come into play. It's still a good idea to use regular weights for speed reps sometimes, since the resistance on a bar can be more precisely calibrated for what the athlete needs, but not everything has to happen in the weight room, and doing work is still doing work. To oversimplify, a wrestler who's building overall strength should work more full ranges of motion. Someone who's lacking strength within a specific movement can lean more towards heavy partial reps that support that movement. Someone who may be strong enough but can't do things quickly enough may want to work in more speed reps. There are better and worse ways to do all this, but again, to get more specific would be stepping too far out of my lane. Number 5. It's not wrong to do the cardio-intensive traditional training early and lift late. A common refrain among lifters who want or need to do cardio is to lift first, do cardio second, but there isn't a significant physiological reason for one order to be better than the other. If you lift, then run, you probably won't do as well running because you're tired. If you run, then lift, you probably won't lift as well because you're tired. It's generally better to do the thing that's more important to you first because you'll have more energy for it. If we apply that to sumo, the automatic assumption is probably that the core training is more important, so do that first. Coach Nakamura seems to be leaning that way as well. But pay attention to how the plan is going and think about changing the order of the workouts if, for example, it seems like the guys could get more out of lifting if it's done in the morning. In fact, the stable could take advantage of the fact workout programs often change after 3 weeks because the 4th week is when plateauing starts to occur. Since bashos are 6 to 7 weeks apart, they could experiment with 3 weeks of lifting in the morning and core training in the afternoon, followed by 3 weeks of the reverse. The last idea is maybe the most important, and fortunately is something it sounds like Nakamura is already planning on. Make sure your guys get enough rest. His intention is to give them 2 rest days instead of 1 during the week. I don't know if they'll be split up or if it'll be like Monday through Friday workouts and weekends off, but 6 days on and 1 day off is already extremely questionable for sumo wrestlers. Elite athletes in lots of sports maintain that type of schedule, so it's hardly unheard of, but sumo training is a unique type of grind, and it's done by men intentionally carrying levels of weight that are difficult for their joints to bear. And athletes who work out 6 days a week often have schedules with harder and easier days. Nothing I've seen indicates pro Rikishi have light days. The thing is, if you get into the physiology of it, the schedule isn't that surprising. When you do essentially the same thing day in and day out, you adapt to the difficulty. By the end of the workout, you may be completely trashed, but you're more or less ready to go the next day because that's what you've become accustomed to. That's on both the mental and physical side. Mentally, you know it's coming, so you're more ready, and physically, since there are few unusual stresses placed on the muscles to make them extra tired, it's less likely you reach a point where you feel like you need an extra day of rest. But those unusual stresses are what force adaptation and improvement. And while I understand if it sounds like most of what I've said about training is in relation to performance, all of it also applies to injury risk. Forcing these adaptations before an injury occurs is the best way to build the body to be as resistant to injury as possible. Improved performance also reduces injury risk because it's a lot easier to get hurt getting yeeted than doing the yeeting. An intelligent approach to rest, however, needs to go beyond just 2 planned days off and then gung-ho with everything the rest of the time. Aches and pains and minor injuries are unavoidable, but getting out of the mindset of grinding through pain while doing the expected work is a huge part of limiting how serious injuries become. And it absolutely does not require a reduced effort on the athlete's part. Knee injuries, for example, are a major issue in the sport. If someone feels a twinge in their knee but keeps grinding, maybe it works itself out, but maybe it doesn't. On the other hand, they can stop the current exercise and work on something else instead. If the knee is only complaining in certain types of movements, they could do a bunch of bodyweight squats or extra shikos, whatever doesn't hurt. If it's a little worse and the knee is in pain no matter what, that's a time for extra upper body work. There's always an option for exercise and improvement that doesn't risk aggravating minor pain, and that makes it much more likely the wrestler is back working at full force in a couple of days rather than dealing with a nagging pain for weeks or worse. Alright, to cap this video, remember all the way back at the start when we talked about the need for new young people to join the sport and how I didn't have a good suggestion for how to do that? I lied. Here's an idea that has no chance in hell of ever happening and maybe isn't even a good idea given the dwindling numbers of athletes in sumo, but nonetheless, Rikishi under 18 should not be required to compete. As I understand it, someone can technically stay at a stable without competing, but they're a guest and the Sumo Association doesn't support them. What I mean is that the Sumo Association should give the same support pay to stables with under 18s who don't compete that they do for each of the stable's active wrestlers. It's not that these kids are at an unusually high risk of injury. They're often a lot smaller than the grown-ass men around them for obvious reasons, but the competition tends to be quite slow and plodding in most of the bottom 2 divisions. Still, a lot of their opponents are grown-ass men who will knock the shit out of them given a chance, so some risk exists, and I'm not convinced putting them in the ring does much good. Consider, what's the use of a 90-kilo kid fighting men 1.5 to 2 times his size? The main benefit is experience. With any combat sport, being in the ring is a lot different than practice, no matter how much you practice, and it takes some acclimation. When wrestlers come in from high school or university, they may be new to the pro scene, but they often have a decent amount of experience fighting tough competition. A 15 or 16-year-old who was just wrestling middle schoolers a couple years ago is making a much bigger jump and needs to get his feet wet. So the experience argument does make sense. However, that same kid isn't built the way he will be when he's a little older and has had a couple years to eat and train and grow. How he fights may easily change as he gets bigger and stronger. More to the point, someone who finds success in a combat sport with certain tactics will connect those tactics with victory, but may find it more difficult to switch gears to another strategy as they grow and develop and potentially become better at different aspects of the sport. This is even more possible with sumo wrestlers given the size difference from start to finish in a kid who turns the sport into a genuine career. The body he'll have for most of his life as a Rikishi is not the one he has at 15 or 16. So, experience when you're young and smaller is arguably less useful than in other sports where you'll grow but maintain the same general fitness and form. On the other hand, eating and lifting and working out without the stress of prepping for competition allows someone to simply do whatever is most effective for their development. There doesn't need to be as much focus on technique improvement right away if a kid isn't gonna be in the ring. They'll be more free to build the best sumo body they can while taking fewer knocks along the way. Plus, if a stable master feels a young wrestler needs a taste of what competition is like, nothing's stopping him from having some of the older Rikishi really take it to the kid. But even then, it can be done in a limited and controlled way. I think this is especially important with the literal growth of modern Rikishi. There's not a good way of searching how different age groups do in sumo, but I did look up when all the Yokozuna of the modern era started in the sport and when they reached Juryo. From Kashiwado, the 47th Yokozuna, to Onokuni, the 62nd, only 2 of them started after age 18, Granddaddy Kotozakura and Wajima. 2 others were 17, Tochi no Umi and Sado no Yama, and 1 was 16, Taiho. The other 11 were younger. Wajima is a special case since he began at 22 at Makushita 60 and is thus far the only Yokozuna not to begin his career at the bottom of the Banzuke. Kotozakura took 3.5 years to reach Juryo. That's the 3rd fastest of that group of Yokozuna to do it. The 2 who did it faster, Taiho and Tochi no Umi. Everyone who came in at 15 or younger took longer. And it makes sense. The younger guys had more growing and developing to do, and that's despite the fact every one of them joined the sport before the huge jump in average rikishi size during the 80s. After Onokuni, everything changed. Asahi Fuji, the 63rd Yokozuna, joined the sport at 20.5 years old and made Juryo in just over a year. 5 of the 10 Yokozuna after Asahi Fuji joined at 18 or older, and only 2 joined at 15. The 3 16-year-olds who joined, Hakuho, Haruma Fuji, and Kakuryu, took the longest of this group to reach Juryo. Interestingly, the 2 15-year-olds, Takano Hana and Kiseno Sato, wound up being the only ones of all of them to make Juryo at 17. Obviously they were ready, that's why the proposal is for competition by under-18s to be optional, not banned. But, just as obviously, those 2 were very rare cases. In short, on average, being older and more grown when you start competing simply helps. Your body is more ready for the stresses and impacts of competition. This leads to both less damage when you get hit or thrown, and a greater ability to attack opponents successfully, limiting how often you even get hit or thrown. As for the impact on the Banzuke, if every rikishi who was under 18 sat out in May 2024, that would drop 43 wrestlers from the competition. There were 625 listed, so that ain't nothing. But in May 2014, there were 80 wrestlers under 18 out of 664 listed. 39 fewer wrestlers total, 37 fewer under 18. The under 18s are basically the whole difference. And this is why I bring this up, because it's the one way I think the sport can start to get more young athletes involved. Everyone can see how big grown-ass sumo wrestlers are. The size difference between them and even a talented teenager on its own is enough to push that kid away from joining the sport early if he has any other option for what to do with his life, and you have to figure the vast majority would at least be content to focus on high school. There's no reason to risk getting all beat up as a kid when you can jump in after high school or university as a more grown man. But if stables were allowed to recruit young athletes and physically build them up before putting them in the official ring, I mean, it couldn't hurt, right? And maybe, someday, we'd see more wrestlers putting on an athletic show and far fewer wearing braces, wraps, and bands around their knees. Thanks for coming on this ride with me. Between the original plan and the rewrite after talking to John Gunning, this has essentially been my Between Bashos project, and as you can see, it's still barely getting out before the July tournament starts. But I feel like everything I learned along the way made it worth the effort, and if you've made it to the end, hopefully you agree. As always, likes and comments are appreciated and help push the video out to more people, which is something I aim for with these bigger and, to me, more important topics. If you'd like to get yourself something nice and support the channel at the same time, SumoSpiffy.com has these sweet Tobizaru and Pura mugs, as well as Sumo Kittens apparel. Or, if you want to support the channel but spend less money, you could be the first to give us a super thanks. Part of me feels weird bringing it up, but really, it can be as little as $2, and I'm more interested in getting one so I can see how it looks on our end than in the money itself. Okay, the Nagoya Basho is starting soon. Get ready for the action, and keep an eye out for our silly-ass community polls and posts during the tournament. I'll see you soon.